A couple of the issues that I have long had with apologetics is the amount of blatant dishonesty that often takes place, and just how often apologists will go out of their way to justify apathy to their audiences. In the pursuit of truth, it has always been my position that we should necessarily call out whenever and wherever we find individuals who sanctify intellectual dishonesty and laziness as if they were virtues. So having said that, let's call some out.
This archaeological discovery shows that the Bible really is the inspired word of God.
Now, the field of archaeology is specifically concerned with the study of past human life and cultures through the examination of objects made, modified, or utilized by humans. Scientists working in this field look for clues to what ancient life and cultures looked like through scientific excavation and analysis of physical finds such as structures, tools, pottery, jewelry, and weapons. One thing that's always important to remember, though, is that archaeology is an interdisciplinary field, meaning that it heavily overlaps with numerous other academic fields of study. Fields that include anthropology, geology, chemistry, physics, biology, archaeobotany, paleopathology, climatology, forensic sciences, and even linguistics, just to name a few of them. You'll also probably recognize that many of the fields that I just listed are also themselves interdisciplinary.
Yes, science!
Now, the problem in this clip is that the assertion is being made that the field of archaeology, which itself has nothing to do with determining the truth of theological claims, has not only confirmed what we would naturally expect it to confirm, that a tiny selected group of people in a small section of the world happen to believe a particular set of theological claims, but that the field of archaeology is somehow able to go one step further and confirm that these specific theological claims that are believed by this small group of people in this small section of the world are also true, which implies it also simultaneously is proving that all of the other theological claims believed by every other group from all around the world throughout human history are also false. It's a pretty impressive conclusion to be sure, especially given that the field in question definitionally possesses no mechanism by which it would derive such conclusions.
Is there any credence to this idea that the Bible was copied regionally between other river valley civilization mythologies?
So this is an important point when it comes to studying the historicity of the Bible, especially when it comes to the Old Testament. Over the generations of study, scholars have found that many of the legal codes, stories, and literary elements contained within the Bible either parallel or are directly borrowed from older cultures such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. Examples of this include the flood narrative in Genesis, the Ten Commandments in Exodus, the ethical principles in Proverbs, and even elements surrounding the Messiah figure in the Gospels. So Charlie's question here goes towards the conclusions of Hebrew and biblical scholarship, that the surviving texts and fragments on papyrus and ostraca indicate that Hebrew scribes borrowed heavily from the mythologies of older cultures. So the obvious answer to this question is yes, the claims have credence. And while the interdisciplinary field of archaeology would be heavily relied upon to support that conclusion, all it indicates is that the conclusion that the things that these ancient people believed to be true were cultural mutations of things that prior people believed to be true is itself true. Not that what these specific people believed was true, only that they believed it was true. Big distinction there. But then again, this is Frank Turek that Charlie Kirk is talking to, so let's see how he addresses it.
Here's the problem. If you look at the archaeology, so let's go back to Joshua and Jericho.
Okay, some necessary context here. We have the story contained in the book, and we have what the field of archaeology can ascertain from the surviving clues about what most likely happened. When it comes to the Bible, the book of Joshua contains the story of when the Israelites, during their bloody conquest of the Promised Land, miraculously destroyed the defensive walls of Jericho by shouting at them and sounding their trumpets after marching around the city for a week as their God commanded them to. The story then goes on to describe the walls of Jericho as falling directly outwards and the Israelites then using them as ramps in order to access the interior of the city. They then proceeded to put every single man, woman, and child they found to the torch, save for Rahab and her family, for their protection of Israelite spies. That's the whole red cord in the window story you might remember from Bible school. Now, according to biblical chronology, this event is said as taking place in between 1406 and 1400 BCE. But when it comes to the field of archaeology, things get a bit murkier. Tel es Sultan, the ancient site of Jericho, was first excavated by Charles Warren in 1868. Larger scale excavations began in 1907 and continue to various degrees of size to this day. Now, first and foremost, the archaeological findings regarding the ancient city of Jericho are scant at best. But thanks to the years of meticulous efforts by individuals such as as Kathleen Kenyon and Lorenzo Nigro, the current scholarly consensus is that the city of Jericho showed human habitation going back to 10,000 BCE, and that the original city in its prime was actually destroyed several centuries before the traditional dating of the Exodus. After that, by the time the Israelites got coordinated and started rolling through on their conquest of the Promised Land, the once proud city of Jericho had long since been reduced to a remnant settlement, fortified only by a stone and mud brick retaining wall. The findings also concluded that there was some form of a destructive event that occurred in Jericho around 1550 BCE, which of course predates the biblical narrative by well over a century. And this is also paralleled by the geological evidence that there was an earthquake that struck the seismically active area around the same time period, which is hypothesized as being a possible reason for Jericho's final collapse. Remember, archaeology is interdisciplinary. But there is also the strong possibility that the walls of Jericho were breached by the Israelites using a popular siege tactic called undermining, in which the foundation of a fortified wall is structurally compromised by tunneling underneath it. And you have to admit that surrounding the settlement with the spectacle of marching and shouting soldiers and priests playing trumpets would provide adequate cover for such a tactic. But ultimately, given the lack of independent historical recording of the events claimed in the Bible that depict the Israelites' conquest of Canaan, we can see that while scant, the archaeological evidence more contradicts the biblical narrative than confirms it. But most importantly out of all of this, it in no way confirms the existence of any god or gods or the occurrence of any miracles, because that's not what archaeology does. Such questions are left to the field of theology. The field of archaeology just confirms that there was a destructive event that occurred at some time in the past and that the Hebrew scribes were pretty loose with how they recorded it.
The evidence from Jericho shows that the walls fell down and out. There's no other city that has ever been discovered where the walls have fallen straight down and out. When you take over a city, you go inward, you crush the wall, you knock it down, and the walls go inward.
What Frank is saying here is partially correct. In the context of siege warfare, defensive walls often fall inwards due to being attacked from the outside. Hit a wall, push it over. Pretty simple concept. So the walls of Jericho falling outward in the specific context of siege warfare is unusual, but it's not unheard of. See the siege tactic of undermining that I mentioned earlier. But another major issue here is if you begin your analysis of the past events with the assumption that what is depicted in the Bible is verbatim truth, and you accept that the walls fell under that specific condition sans the possibility of any undermining, which of course is an assumption that the field of archaeology will not make because there is no rational justification to do so. Walls falling outward due to things like construction design flaws, heavy backfill, expansive soil, hydrostatic pressure, and seismic activity are extremely common occurrences, and the evidence available via the field of archaeology does not indicate that the walls fell for any specific reason. It only posits possible reasons without making any unnecessary assumptions as to why they would fall that specifically align with the available evidence.
Here, we find in the dirt there in Jericho that the walls fell out, just like the Bible says.
Confirming that the walls fell a certain way does not confirm why they fell that way. The Bible claims it was divine intervention. The field of archaeology concludes via the evidence that there are several naturalistic possibilities. Now you have to ask yourself, one, which one of these conclusions is begging the question, and two, which is making more assumptions than is logically necessary.
We just did a 22 one-hour lesson series on the top archaeological discoveries of the Bible, Charlie. We discovered over 107, I think it was 107 people in the Bible that have been found in the dirt. And about 75 of them were from the Old Testament.
I know, what Frank just said there is really weird on its face, because he's either claiming that 107 people that were mentioned in the Bible had their remains found and directly confirmed by archaeologists, which would be a flat-out lie, or he's claiming that 107 people that were mentioned in the Bible have been confirmed to have actually existed by the field of archaeology, which would be more in line with the evidence, and he just worded it terribly. My money's on the latter. Also, that these people existed is not evidence of the existence of any kind of a god or gods.
And many of the events of the Old Testament have corroborative data in the dirt.
Yes, the field of archaeology has confirmed that many events that were historically recorded did in fact happen, but that in no way translates to a god existing. And I have to put it out there that it's really weird these guys keep putting forward the field of archaeology as the field that answers that question.
How would somebody writing the Old Testament, say 1,000 years after Joshua, 1406 BC, know that the walls fell down and out? How would he know that? wouldn't.
Actually, he likely would have. The Book of Joshua was likely written between 1400 and 1370 BCE, possibly even during or shortly after the lifetime of Joshua himself. And while the Book of Joshua does not have a named author, it is traditionally believed that Joshua himself wrote significant portions of it, with other unknown individuals coming along at unknown periods of time after to make their own additions and edits to the narrative. Now, working from the assumption that the traditional authorship is true, which by the way is a fairly big assumption, basic logic would tell you that if it was in fact Joshua who wrote significant portions of the book, and Joshua was the one who led the Israelites in their siege against Jericho, then he would ostensibly know that the walls fell down and outwards. So what Frank just said here is a flat out lie. But the real question that these two guys are conspicuously not asking is why, if Joshua was the one who wrote the account, doesn't the archaeological evidence directly support the biblical narrative? It's intellectual dishonesty 101. And I think it goes without saying that concluding that a particular god or gods exists just because a group of individuals who also believe that God exists happen to write down somewhat accurately historical events is not rationally supported. Let's see what they have next.
Greatest intellectual defender of atheism in the 20th century. His name was Anthony Flew.
The subject of philosopher Anthony Flew has been one mired in contention since his passing in 2010. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with him, Anthony Flew was considered one of the leading atheist philosophers. He was an early advocate for atheism, arguing that the God concept was definitionally unfalsifiable and that the burden of proof lay squarely upon the theists themselves. He held that the position of atheism should be the default until sufficient evidence is presented for the existence of a God. Ever heard of the no true Scotsman fallacy? He's the one who coined that in his 1971 book, Thinking About Thinking, presenting the falsification criteria for theological statements. That was him. Now, towards the end of his life in 2004, Flew made the announcement that he had stopped being an atheist because he was now convinced of deism. And in 2007, he published a book titled There Is a God, explaining how he arrived at that conclusion. He described his conversion as being a result of his personal study of DNA and interpreting what he perceived as being evidence of intelligent design. From that point forward, Flew held to the position that there is, or at least there was, an intelligence behind everything, but he continued to reject any form of religious or theological notions. He remained a strident critic of both Islam and Christianity, and he held strictly to classical deism. Now, the contention that arose around this event was predominantly due to the fact that it was becoming increasingly well known that in his later years, Flew was suffering from dementia, a condition that would ultimately be the contributing factor to his death in 2010. And the fact that Flew himself confirmed that his co-writer on the book, Christian author Roy Abraham Varghese, a devout Catholic, handled the bulk of the writing of the project only served to fuel the flames of conspiracy. Today, whether or not Flew's conversion was legitimate will be forever mired in speculation. If Flew was convinced of deism for what would basically amount to bad reasons like an argument from personal incredulity is also up for debate. Hell, the old man may have even been trying to hedge his bets right there at the end while still holding fast to his intellectual honesty. Who knows? But it must be noted that Flew changing his mind is in no way itself evidence of the existence of any kind of a god.
He never became a Christian. He rejected Christianity entirely. This is what he says about the resurrection.
If this is going where I think it's going, this is going to be interesting.
The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It is outstanding, different in quality and quantity.
So that quote that you just heard was said by Flew, and it was said during an informal interview that Flew gave with his longtime friend, resurrection apologist Gary Habermas back in 2004 after he made his big announcement. The transcript of this interview, interestingly titled My Pilgrimage from Atheism to Theism, a discussion between Anthony Flew and Gary Habermas, despite the fact that Flew identified as a deist, was published by Habermas in the winter of 2004 and is available via Liberty University's Digital Commons. Now, going back to the quote itself, I'm willing to bet that you've probably already guessed what the problem here is. And if that guess was that that quote was being cherry-picked, you'd be 100% correct. Flew's quote appears on page 209 of the transcript, and it was in response to a question that Habermas had asked him. So needless to say, there's some critical details here that this guy is leaving out. Habermas: You and I have had 3 dialogues on the resurrection of Jesus. Are you any closer to thinking that the resurrection could have been a historical fact? Flu. No, I don't think so. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity, I think, from the evidence offered for the occurrence of most other supposedly miraculous events. But you must remember that I approached it after considerable reading of reports of psychical research and its criticisms. This showed me how quickly evidence of remarkable and supposedly miraculous events can be discredited. What the psychical researcher looks for is evidence from witnesses of the supposedly paranormal events recorded as soon as possible after their occurrence. What we do not have is evidence from anyone who was in Jerusalem at the time who witnessed one of the allegedly miraculous events and recorded his or her testimony immediately after the occurrence of that allegedly miraculous event. Yeah, there appears to be some pretty important context to Flu's quote there, but let's see if this guy mentions any of it.
This guy is admitting Christianity is the best evidence than any other religion. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is better than any religious miracle claim ever made, and this guy never became a Christian.
Yeah, I didn't think he would. Flu was in no way stating that Christianity had the best evidence that the resurrection was historical. He was stating that the quality of the evidence presented for the resurrection is better when it's compared to the quality of evidence that's presented for the miraculous events in other religions. And promptly after that, Flu goes on to explain exactly why the evidence presented for the resurrection is not sufficient enough for him to conclude that it was a historical event. So as usual, when it comes to apologetics, the commandments are really more conditional than they are universals. Let's see what else they have.
Is the rapture happening on September 23rd? Let me explain why a lot of people are talking about this.
So I actually just found out about this new rapture prediction, and apparently it's being predicted for September 23rd and 24th for this year. And I also find it mildly interesting that the day of September 23rd has popped up once again, because that's the exact same day that David Meade used when he predicted that the rapture would take place back in 2017. Now, the significance of this day is due to how these individuals are interpreting biblical scripture and combining it with numerology and a little dash of astrology for flavor. And while not supported in any way by biblical scholarship, I'm actually inclined to believe that it was Meade's incorporation of the fictional planet Nibiru into his prophecy that led to many people dismissing it. But here we are again with yet another rapture prediction that will ultimately fulfill these death cultists' persistent fixation on dying for what they believe.
So on September 23rd, the UN is meeting, like they do every September, where they talk about global challenges and try to build a global consensus on the things going on in the world.
The United Nations General Assembly convenes every year in the month of September at the UN headquarters in New York City. The session runs intensively until December and then resumes in January, where members meet to address the agenda. This year, we'll see the 80th session of the UNGA convene, and it will open on September 9th with the general debate portion beginning on September 23rd. The event will feature lots of high-level general debate and a lot of world leaders delivering speeches about whatever global issues they think are important at the time. So I must ask, how exactly does this translate to the world ending?
But here's why people are concerned about this year's meeting. There's talk about a peace treaty happening between Israel and Palestine.
I hate to be the naysayer here, but that appears to be highly unlikely. Despite multiple international pushes for a two-state solution, the conflict in Gaza has risen to epic proportions, culminating as we speak with the Israeli government systematically starving out the Palestinian population. So yes, in the words of Nietzsche, it does appear that Israel has gazed too long into the abyss and has finally become that which it once struggled against. And despite almost worldwide condemnation of Israel for the atrocities it's committing against the Palestinian people, no country is lifting even a finger to try and stop them. So until someone is willing to step up against the Israeli government for their actions, I don't see these horrors ending anytime soon.
Now, if you're not familiar with Bible prophecy, the Bible actually prophesies that this peace treaty marks the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, which a lot of Christians believe that this will be around the time where the church will be raptured.
So this little bit of end times trivia is taken from the books of Isaiah and Daniel, and the prophecy is that Israel will be deceived into signing a peace treaty by the Antichrist, and then after 3.5 years of peace, that treaty will be used as a pretext to invade Israel, capture Jerusalem, and establish the Antichrist at the restored Third Temple. End times proponents believe that these events will take place in the wake of the global devastation caused by the rapture, with the signing of the treaty being seen as the start of the 7 years of tribulation as described in Daniel's apocalyptic dream. So if the rapture doesn't take place, and a peace treaty is somehow signed between Israel Israel and Palestine, these death cultists will quickly find themselves going back to the numerology, astrology drawing board.
Now, there's a lot of Christians that believe that the church will be raptured post-trib, around the time where Jesus actually returns. There's some Christians that believe it'll happen mid-trib. I don't know.
Well, that's the problem of hermeneutics for you. None of them actually know what the right interpretation is, or even if the right interpretation could be ascertained at this point, but each of them is so utterly certain that their interpretation is the correct one.
But here's what I do know. Jesus is coming back.
Oh, really?
And the church will be raptured. We're going to be caught up with him in the air, and we're going to be behind him as he comes back to take dominion of the earth.
Unfortunately for you, that's not a knowledge claim. You may call it that, but it's really just something that you believe. And I get that you believe it because that's the interpretation of the events that you're convinced will happen. Not all of your fellow Christians agree with you, but that's for you to argue with them. My questioning, of course, would be how exactly did you determine that holding that belief as being true is rationally justified? And I still have yet to get an answer to it.
He's coming to put an end to the madness in this world.
Well, what you subjectively interpret as being madness. I just interpret it as a continuation of tribalistic human behavior. We as a species will either figure out how to live in peace globally with one another for the betterment of the planet and ourselves, or we won't and will wind up relegating our own species to being the last entry on the list of species that we've already driven to extinction.
And my question for you is, are you ready for that?
And my response would be, why exactly would I care about anything your mythology says when you can't even demonstrate that your God exists for any of it to be true?
Do you know him?
I have a pretty decent understanding of the character that appears in the book, and as far as I can tell, he was nothing more than a megalomaniacal cult leader who advocated for people hating and leaving their families and castrating themselves for him. And the provinces of first century Rome were filled with people like him. Also, that there was likely a living person who inspired the character that appeared in the book does not logically entail that that individual was supernatural in nature or that what he espoused to be true was actually true.
Have you given him your life? Have you let him wash you clean?
Typically, I don't submit myself to the authority of mythological figures, but I will say, even if I were to do so, Beowulf, King Arthur, or even the Monkey King would be far better role models. And given that sin in the Christian context is not a thing that actually exists, I just don't see the rationality of accepting the claim that I am somehow fundamentally dirty or broken. I have, however, witnessed directly the harm that is caused by indoctrinating children with that idea, and I actually respect myself enough to not cow to your cult's fear tactics.
Because that's the only thing that's gonna matter when he cracks the sky. And regardless of his second coming, tomorrow is not even promised. You know I gotta go there.
Sure, tomorrow isn't promised, so stop allowing fear about things that you don't know will happen to control you and get focused on doing the most with the time that you have. Analysis paralysis is a thing, and if you spend all your time and energy wringing your hands about things that make you afraid even though you don't know that they are true, you'll never get anything done in this life.
Because I may be the only one in your life that's real enough to tell you the truth.
No, you're telling us your beliefs. You can't demonstrate what you believe to be actually true, which means in the end, all you're really doing here is fear-mongering in the name of your cult.
That's why I constantly talk about this.
Well, you're a cultist, so that tracks.
So this is what I want to leave you with. Jesus is coming back, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's September 23rd. Am I saying it's going to happen on September 23rd? I don't know.
So why the hell would you give that specific date any credence at all? Oh, that's right, stupid me, because you're fear-mongering.
Jesus said only the Father knows the day or the hour, but we do know the season. He said he's coming like a thief in the night and to be ready. And everybody in the Bible, the disciples, they all believed that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime, so how much more should we believe he's coming back in ours?
You got that backwards. The failure of a prophecy to come true within the prophesized time frame does not increase the probability that it will come true outside of that time frame. It's written in your book that your Messiah told his followers that he would return before some of them had tasted death, but that didn't happen. So given that it's over 2,000 years later and it still hasn't happened, and thousands upon thousands of end-time predictions have come and gone without event, then an intellectually honest assessment of the evidence would lead to the conclusion that it most likely will never happen.
We're seeing the birth pains that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. We're seeing the signs right before our eyes.
And the thousands and thousands of end times predictors before you saw events and interpreted them as being signs as well. What exactly makes you any different from them? And if your answer to that question is nothing, then why exactly are you spending your time spreading fear about something that you yourself have zero knowledge about?
And here's the beautiful thing about it. You can have peace through all of that because you're right with God. You don't have to worry because he loves you. He's going to protect you.
And that's the kicker. Ultimately, if you believe this stuff, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to worry about fixing any problems. You don't have to worry about the continuation of our species. You don't have to worry about climate change or pollution or genocide or pandemics or biome collapse or nuclear war. Because you're all good with God, you don't really have to concern yourself with such material concepts anymore. Just bend your happy Christian ass over, stick your head in the fucking sand, and wait patiently for the cloud wizard to arrive to take your soul on a sky ride. Sit back and relax. We non-believers are more than happy to pick up your slack.
Oh.
So if you're not in that place with God right now and you want to be, I could explain the whole thing to you right now and you can start your own relationship with God. Just tap that link below.
Yeah, you'd first have to demonstrate that it actually exists for any of your asserted mythology or theology to be substantive in any way. And seeing as how you have yet to do that here or anywhere else on your channel, I can only conclude that the only reason you're really here is to try and prey upon people's ignorance and fear to convince them to join your cult. And just spitballing here, but it's likely because you yourself are scared, and making other people as scared as you are makes you feel just a tiny bit better. So as you can see, intellectual dishonesty, intellectual laziness, and straight up apathy, especially when it comes to our responsibilities to other people, to the society we live in, and to the very planet that we depend upon. It's literally belief in this kind of crap that keeps members of our current Congress from voting in favor of climate change resolutions. Because why should they worry about throwing money towards offsetting anthropogenic climate change when they firmly believe that their God is returning to Earth to collect them within their lifetimes? And meanwhile, the rest of us are stuck trying to make up for their apathy in the off chance that their incoherent nonsense turns out to not be true. But I'm not so pessimistic to think that we can't do better, that we can't be better. People like the individuals here, and this was just a random sampling, only need to be provided a rational reason to get the hell out of their own way. Because if more believers around the world actually had the stones to be intellectually honest about what they believe, I think together we'd start to make some real progress both for the planet and for ourselves. Be safe, be excellent to each other. I'll see you next time.